No one in Blackridge Valley dared to speak Marcus Hale's name above a whisper. The rancher who owned nearly half the valley land was known as a man carved from stone, harder than the mountains that surrounded his property. Stories traveled through town about how he once chased off a group of armed cattle thieves with nothing but a rifle and his cold, unwavering stare. Others claimed he fired workers without warning for the smallest mistakes. Children crossed the street when his massive black truck rolled through town, and grown men lowered their voices whenever he entered the feed store. Marcus Hale had built his reputation on disciplined silence, and a loneliness so thick it clung to him like the dust clouds trailing behind his boots. His ranch sat miles outside town, a sprawling empire of grazing cattle, creaking barns, and endless fences stretching across golden plains. To outsiders, it was a symbol of power and success. To Marcus, it was simply work that started before sunrise and ended long after the sky swallowed the last light. He lived alone in a weathered but sturdy ranch house overlooking the land his father had left him 20 years ago. Back when Marcus still believed life could offer something besides responsibility. He hadn't spoken about his past in years, and no one dared to ask. On a bitterly cold autumn evening, as gray storm clouds gathered over the valley, Marcus was returning from checking the southern pasture. His boots were heavy with mud, his coat stiff with wind and dust, and his expression locked in its usual grim focus. The storm carried sharp rain that struck the truck windshield like tiny bullets. He hated driving in bad weather, but hated unfinished work even more. As he rounded the final bend leading toward the main ranch road, something unusual caught his eye near the old broken fence line. A small figure crouched beside the wooden posts, barely visible through the sheets of rain. Marcus slowed the truck instinctively, though his jaw tightened with irritation. Trespassers weren't uncommon. Desperate drifters sometimes wandered onto his land hoping to steal tools or livestock. He parked the truck roughly, leaving the engine running, and stepped out into the storm. The wind pushed against him as he approached, boots crunching against gravel and soaked earth. "You're on private land," he barked, his deep voice cutting through the rain like a warning shot. The figure flinched but didn't run. As Marcus stepped closer, he realized it wasn't a thief or a grown drifter. It was a girl no older than 14 or 15, wrapped in layers of torn clothing far too thin for the freezing weather. Her hair was tangled and soaked, sticking to her pale face, and her hands trembled violently as she clutched a small, ripped backpack to her chest. Marcus stopped several feet away, studying her with narrowed eyes. He had no patience for trouble, and trouble often arrived in small, unexpected forms. "Name," he demanded. The girl hesitated, her lips blue from cold, before whispering, "Leela." The name hung in the air, fragile as glass. Marcus crossed his arms. "You lost." She shook her head slowly. "No place to go." The simplicity of her answer stirred an uncomfortable sensation in Marcus's chest, one he quickly buried beneath his usual steel composure. He glanced toward the darkening horizon, calculating the distance to town, the worsening storm, and the liability of leaving a miner alone on his land. Every practical instinct told him to drive her to the sheriff's station and let someone else handle it. He turned halfway toward the truck, already deciding. But then he heard it, a faint, unmistakable sound, her stomach growling. The noise was small, almost drowned by the rain, yet it hit Marcus harder than he expected. He turned back and noticed how thin she was, how her oversized jacket hung from her shoulders like it belonged to someone else entirely. "When did you last eat?" he asked gruffly, almost annoyed by his own question. Leela stared at the ground. "Yesterday morning, I think." The words struck something deep inside Marcus, something he hadn't felt in years, a memory of a smaller voice, a smaller pair of hands reaching for his during a winter long buried in his past. His expression hardened as if trying to crush the memory before it surfaced completely. He exhaled slowly, running a rough hand across his beard. "Get in the truck," he ordered. Leela's eyes widened with disbelief. I won't steal anything," she said quickly. Marcus frowned. "Didn't say you would. Just get in before you freeze to death." "I'm not digging graves tonight." She scrambled to her feet, nearly stumbling from exhaustion, and hurried toward the passenger door. Marcus walked around to the driver's side, his movements sharp and deliberate, as if he might still change his mind at any moment. When he climbed inside, the truck filled with the faint scent of damp clothes and cold air. Leela sat stiffly, clutching her backpack as though it held her entire life inside it. They drove in silence, the windshield wipers beating a steady rhythm against the storm. Marcus kept his eyes on the road, telling himself this was temporary, practical, and nothing more. He would give her food, call the authorities, and be done with it. Yet something unsettled him as they approached the ranch house. its porch light glowing faintly through the rain like a distant lighthouse. For the first time in years, someone else would cross the threshold of his home. When they stepped inside, the warmth from the wood, burning stove wrapped around them instantly. Leela hesitated near the doorway, afraid to move further, leaving muddy footprints on the old wooden floor. Marcus shrugged off his coat and hung it on a rusted hook before pointing toward the kitchen. "Sit." She obeyed instantly, lowering herself onto a chair like it might collapse beneath her. Marcus opened the refrigerator and scanned its contents. His meals usually consisted of leftovers and practical ranch food. Nothing fancy, nothing comforting. He pulled out a pot of beef stew he had cooked 2 days earlier and set it on the stove to reheat. The smell slowly filled the kitchen, rich and savory. Leela watched silently, her eyes fixed on the pot like it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Marcus noticed the way her hands trembled in her lap, how she swallowed repeatedly as the scent grew stronger. He poured the stew into a bowl and placed it in front of her along with a thick slice of bread. "Eat," he said, his voice quieter now, almost unfamiliar to his own ears. Leela hesitated for half a second, as if expecting the meal to vanish, then grabbed the spoon and began eating with desperate urgency. Marcus leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching. Something shifted in the room as she ate, a fragile, invisible change neither of them could name yet. And Marcus Hale, the most feared rancher in Blackridge Valley, felt the first crack form in the walls he had built around his heart for nearly 2 decades. Leela ate as though the world might end before she finished the bowl, her spoon clinking rapidly against the ceramic while steam curled upward around her face. Marcus watched in silence, his posture rigid against the kitchen counter, though his eyes betrayed a careful attention he would never admit. The girl barely paused to breathe, breaking the bread into uneven chunks and dipping them into the stew with trembling fingers. Years of ranch life had trained Marcus to notice details others missed: a limping calf, a broken fence wire, storm clouds gathering behind distant hills, and now those same instincts studied Leela with quiet intensity. Her clothes were layered but threadbare, patched in mismatched fabrics that suggested long stretches of survival rather than care. Dirt stained her sleeves, and her boots were 2 sizes too large, stuffed with what looked like newspaper for insulation. The sight triggered a discomfort Marcus tried to bury beneath practicality. He turned back to the stove, pretending to adjust the heat even though it was already perfect. Leela slowed after several minutes, her urgency replaced by disbelief as she realized the food was not being taken away. She lifted her eyes cautiously toward Marcus, who still refused to meet her gaze. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice fragile, like she wasn't used to saying those words. Marcus grunted in response, a sound that hovered somewhere between acknowledgement and dismissal. The rain hammered harder against the roof, filling the silence with a steady roar that made the ranch house feel isolated from the rest of the world. Marcus poured a glass of water and set it beside her without comment. Leela drank it carefully, as if stretching the moment, savoring each swallow. He noticed how she glanced around the kitchen with a mixture of curiosity and fear, taking in the rough wooden cabinets, the faded family photos on the far wall, and the long scar across the dining table from an old accident involving a chainsaw years ago. Her eyes lingered on one particular photograph, a younger Marcus standing beside a woman with warm eyes and a small boy perched on his shoulders. Marcus followed her gaze and felt his chest tighten like a rope being pulled too quickly. Without thinking, he stepped in front of the photo, blocking it from view. Leela immediately lowered her eyes, sensing she had crossed an invisible line. Marcus cleared his throat roughly. "You traveling alone?" he asked, his tone returning to businesslike distance. Leela nodded slowly. "For a while. Family." The single word hung heavy between them. She hesitated, gripping the spoon tightly enough to whiten her knuckles. "No." Marcus studied her for a long moment, weighing the truth in her answer. Years of dealing with ranch hands had sharpened his ability to read lies, and something about the way she said it, not defensive, not rehearsed, just empty, made him believe her. He pushed himself off the counter and walked toward the hallway. "Bathroom's second door on the right. There's clean towels in the cabinet. You're dripping all over my floor." Leela blinked in surprise but nodded quickly, standing so fast her chair scraped loudly against the wood. She clutched her backpack before hesitating. "Can I leave this here?" Marcus shrugged. "Not like I've got anything worth stealing." She placed the bag carefully beside the chair, as though it contained fragile treasure, and hurried down the hallway. Marcus remained in the kitchen, staring at the half-empty bowl and the crumbs scattered across the table. The house felt different, occupied, unsettled, alive in a way it hadn't been for years. He rubbed his temples, irritated by the unfamiliar sensation. He told himself again this was temporary. Storm would pass. He would drive her to town in the morning. Simple, clean, responsible. Yet the memory of her stomach growling refused to fade. Minutes later, he heard the faint rush of water and the soft thud of cabinet doors opening and closing cautiously. He moved toward the sink, washing an already clean plate simply to keep his hands busy. When Leela returned, her wet hair had been roughly towel-dried, sticking out in uneven strands around her face. Her sleeves were rolled slightly, revealing thin wrists marked by faint bruises she tried to hide by crossing her arms. Marcus noticed but said nothing. "There's extra blankets in the closet," he said gruffly. "You'll sleep on the couch." Relief flooded her expression so quickly it startled him. She nodded repeatedly, whispering another thank you as she moved toward the living room. Marcus followed at a distance, watching as she unfolded the blankets with careful precision, like she feared damaging them. The living room carried the same rugged simplicity as the rest of the house. Worn leather couch, stone fireplace, shelves lined with old ranching manuals and dusty novels his late wife used to read. Leela ran her hand gently across the back of the couch, testing its reality before sitting down. Marcus added another log to the fireplace, sparks leaping upward as flames strengthened. The orange glow filled the room, casting moving shadows across the walls. Leela sat curled under the blanket, her eyes fixed on the fire like it was a story unfolding just for her. "You hungry still?" Marcus asked suddenly. She hesitated before shaking her head. "No, sir." The word "sir" struck him with an unexpected sting. He nodded once and turned toward the hallway. "I get up before sunrise. You stay here. Don't wander. There's equipment around this ranch that'll kill you faster than the cold." She nodded again, shrinking slightly under his stern tone. Marcus paused at the doorway to his bedroom, glancing back. Leela had already begun drifting, her head leaning against the couch arm, exhaustion overtaking fear. He watched for a moment longer than he intended, noticing how young she looked in sleep, how the harsh survival edges softened into something heartbreakingly innocent. He stepped into his room and closed the door halfway, something he hadn't done since his son used to wander the house at night afraid of thunderstorms. Marcus removed his boots and sat heavily on the edge of his bed, staring at the opposite wall where another photograph rested on his nightstand, the same woman and boy, smiling under summer sunlight. He picked it up briefly before placing it face down again. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the windows. Marcus lay back, but sleep refused to come easily. His mind replayed the evening in fragments, the small figure by the fence, the trembling hands, the desperate way she devoured the stew. He told himself he had simply done the right thing, nothing more. But deep within him, beneath layers of grief and isolation, something fragile had begun to stir, something he thought had died the day he buried his family. Hours passed before exhaustion finally pulled him into restless sleep. While down the hallway, beneath the flickering firelight, Leela clutched the blanket tightly, as if afraid the warmth, the roof, and the rare feeling of safety might disappear before morning came. Marcus woke before dawn as he always did, his internal clock shaped by decades of ranch work and responsibility. The storm had weakened overnight, leaving behind a heavy fog that rolled across the valley like a silent tide. He sat up slowly, muscles stiff from a restless night, and reached automatically for his work shirt draped over the chair beside his bed. As he buttoned it, fragments of the previous evening returned with surprising clarity. For a brief moment, he wondered if he had imagined the girl entirely, a trick of loneliness conjured by thunder and memory. He stepped into the hallway quietly, boots in hand, and moved toward the living room. The fireplace had died down to glowing embers, casting a faint reddish glow across the room. Leela still slept on the couch, curled tightly beneath the blankets, her backpack clutched to her chest like a shield. Marcus stood there longer than he meant to, watching her slow, steady breathing. He noticed the way her face relaxed in sleep, the constant tension finally released. It reminded him painfully of mornings years ago, when he would carry his son from the couch after he fell asleep watching old cartoons, careful not to wake him. Marcus inhaled sharply, forcing the memory back into its locked compartment. He moved toward the kitchen and started preparing coffee, the familiar routine grounding his thoughts. The grinding beans, the hiss of boiling water, the rich smell filling the air, these were things he could control. He cracked eggs into a skillet and fried them alongside thick slices of bacon, telling himself he simply needed fuel for a long workday. Yet as he placed 2 plates on the table instead of 1, he paused, staring at them with irritation. Just practical. He muttered under his breath, though no one was there to hear him. The scent of breakfast drifted into the living room, and minutes later, he heard soft movement. Leela appeared hesitantly in the doorway, blankets still wrapped around her shoulders like a cloak. Her hair was messy, her eyes still heavy with sleep, but the moment she smelled the food, her expression filled with disbelief all over again. Marcus didn't look up from the skillet. "Sit," he said simply. She obeyed instantly, lowering herself into the chair with cautious movements. He placed the plate in front of her and poured coffee for himself, sliding a glass of milk toward her without comment. Leela stared at the meal for a long moment before whispering, "You don't have to keep feeding me." Marcus shrugged, taking a sip of coffee. "I don't have to do a lot of things. Eat before it gets cold." She nodded and began eating slower this time, as though trying to behave properly. The quiet between them felt less hostile, more uncertain, like both were stepping onto unfamiliar ground. After several minutes, Marcus spoke again. "You said you've got nowhere to go. That temporary or permanent?" Leela swallowed carefully, setting her fork down. "My mom passed last year. My stepdad didn't want me around after that." Her voice remained flat, but Marcus heard the buried tremor beneath it. "So you ran," he said. She nodded once. "Been moving town to town. Shelters, sometimes. Mostly outside." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her words. He had seen plenty of hardship in his life, droughts that killed cattle, accidents that took workers, winters that nearly crushed the ranch entirely, but the quiet resilience in her voice unsettled him in a different way. "Anyone looking for you?" he asked. She hesitated longer this time. "Maybe. I don't stay long enough to find out." The honesty surprised him. He expected deflection, fear, maybe lies. Instead, she offered simple truth like she had nothing left to lose. Marcus stood and carried his plate to the sink, rinsing it slowly. His mind wrestled with logic and something far less comfortable. The responsible decision was obvious: call social services, inform the sheriff, let trained professionals handle it. That was what any rational adult would do. But the thought of her being pushed back into a system of crowded shelters and strangers stirred an unfamiliar anger in him. He turned toward the window, watching fog roll across the pastures where his cattle grazed like dark shadows against pale grass. "You ever worked before?" he asked suddenly. Leela blinked in surprise. "Odd jobs. Cleaning, helping kitchens sometimes." Marcus nodded slowly. "Ranch work isn't easy. Long hours, cold mornings. Dirty most days." She straightened slightly. "I'm not afraid of work." He studied her thin frame skeptically, but noticed the determination burning behind her tired eyes. It was the same stubborn spark he remembered from his younger self, back when he refused to let drought or debt destroy his family's land. Marcus exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of a decision forming before he fully understood it. "Storm washed out part of my north fence," he said. "Could use an extra set of hands carrying wire and tools. Temporary help. You work, you eat. You don't, you leave." Leela's eyes widened, hope flooding her expression so fast it nearly broke through her composure. "Yes, yes, sir. I mean, yes." Marcus waved off the correction with a grunt. He grabbed his hat and coat, tossing an older, smaller jacket toward her. "Wear that. Your clothes won't survive the wind out there." She caught it carefully, as if receiving something priceless. As they stepped onto the porch together, the morning fog began lifting, revealing endless fields stretching beneath a pale rising sun. Leela stood beside him, staring at the ranch like it was an entirely new world. Marcus adjusted his hat and walked toward the truck without looking back. Yet he slowed his pace just enough for her to keep up. Neither of them realized it yet, but with that simple agreement, work for food, stay for now, their lives had already begun changing in ways neither could control, all because one meal had broken through years of silence, fear, and loss. The first week tested Leela in ways hunger never had. Ranch work did not care about age, past wounds, or exhaustion. It demanded strength, endurance, and quiet obedience to the rhythm of land and livestock. Marcus made no exceptions for her, at least not visibly. He handed her gloves too big for her hands, showed her how to carry fencing wire without slicing her palms open, and demonstrated how to brace wooden posts against the stubborn earth. The mornings were mercilessly cold, and more than once Leela's fingers went numb before the sun climbed high enough to warm the valley. Yet she never complained. Marcus noticed that immediately. Many grown men had quit within days of working for him, muttering curses under their breath as they drove away in frustration. Leela, on the other hand, simply adjusted her grip and tried again. When she stumbled in the mud, she stood up faster than he could offer help. When the wind whipped her hair into her face, she tied it back with a torn strip of fabric from her sleeve. The ranch hands who occasionally passed through cast curious glances at her, but asked no questions. Marcus's silence was law. Still, something shifted in the atmosphere. The ranch, once defined by sharp commands and long stretches of isolation, now carried the faint echo of another set of footsteps. On the fourth morning, while repairing the north fence line, Marcus deliberately handed Leela the heavier toolbox. He expected hesitation. Instead, she lifted it with visible strain and followed him across uneven ground without a word. Halfway there, she nearly dropped it but tightened her jaw and kept moving. Marcus slowed subtly, adjusting his pace so she wouldn't fall behind. He told himself it was efficiency. No sense in wasting time if she collapsed, but the truth dug deeper. That afternoon, clouds rolled in again, threatening another storm. They worked quickly, securing the last of the fence wire. When thunder cracked overhead, Leela flinched instinctively. Marcus noticed. "Storms scare you?" he asked without looking at her. She shook her head, though her eyes betrayed unease. "Used to sleep under bridges when it rained," she said quietly. "Water would drip through cracks. You never knew if it'd flood." Marcus hammered the final nail harder than necessary. Something about the image of her alone beneath a bridge, while rain poured down, made his stomach twist. He had spent years believing the world was harsh and unforgiving. Now he was forced to confront how unevenly that harshness was distributed. As they hurried back toward the truck, rain beginning to fall in heavy drops, Leela slipped on wet grass. Marcus caught her arm before she hit the ground. The contact was brief but startling. Her arm was thinner than it looked, bones sharp beneath skin. He released her quickly, stepping back as if burned. "Watch your footing," he muttered. She nodded, breathless but steady. Back at the house, he prepared soup while she cleaned mud from her boots on the porch without being told. The quiet routine of shared work began settling into something almost natural. That evening, as rain tapped against the windows again, Leela lingered by the bookshelf in the living room. "You read these?" she asked cautiously. Marcus glanced over. "Used to." She ran her fingers lightly across the spines, stopping at an old novel about cattle drives.
"Can I?" He shrugged. "Books don't bite."
She smiled faintly, the first real smile he had seen from her, and settled onto the couch to read. Marcus pretended not to notice how the sound of pages turning filled the house differently than silence ever had. He stepped outside under the covered porch, watching the rain blur the horizon. For years, storms had felt like reminders of loss. Tonight, strangely, the house felt warmer than the fire alone could explain. And Marcus Hale, who once believed fear was the only language that kept the world in order, began to understand that resilience sometimes arrived quietly, carrying a toolbox too heavy for its hands and refusing to fall. Word traveled faster than wind in Blackridge Valley. By the second week, whispers began circling through town. The feared rancher had a girl working his land. Some claimed she was a relative, others suggested something more suspicious. When Marcus drove into town for supplies, conversations paused the moment his truck engine cut off. Leela sat beside him, eyes fixed on her hands. He noticed how her shoulders tightened under invisible scrutiny. Inside the general store, the owner, Mrs. Klein, raised an eyebrow but said nothing directly. "Stocking up more than usual," she remarked carefully. Marcus gave a short nod. "Extra help." Mrs. Klein's gaze softened slightly as she looked at Leela. "Well, help deserves proper boots," she said, disappearing into the back and returning with a sturdy pair only slightly worn. She placed them on the counter without mentioning payment. Marcus stared at them for a long moment before sliding cash across the wood anyway. Pride ran deep in him. Accepting charity felt like surrender. Outside, Leela examined the boots like they were treasure. "I can pay you back," she said quietly. Marcus opened the truck door. "Just don't quit halfway through fence repairs." Yet tension lingered. 2 days later, a sheriff's cruiser rolled slowly past the ranch entrance. Leela froze at the kitchen window, color draining from her face. Marcus followed her gaze. "Expecting someone?" he asked. She shook her head quickly, fear flashing across her features before she masked it. The cruiser didn't turn in, but the message was clear: the valley was watching. That evening, Marcus found Leela sitting on the back steps, staring at the fading sunset. "If they ask you about me," she said without turning around, "you don't have to lie." Marcus leaned against the porch post. "No one's asking." "They might." Silence stretched between them. Finally, she added, "I don't want to cause trouble for you." The statement struck deeper than she realized. Trouble had never scared Marcus. Losing what little stability he had left did. Yet the idea of sending her away to avoid gossip felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. "You're working," he said firmly. "That's all anyone needs to know." She nodded slowly, though doubt lingered in her eyes. The next morning brought a new challenge. One of the younger calves became trapped in a drainage ditch after heavy rain softened the ground. Marcus moved quickly, wading into mud without hesitation. Leela followed despite his sharp command to stay back. The calf struggled violently, threatening to injure itself further. Marcus tried to lift it but lost footing. Without thinking, Leela grabbed a rope from the truck and looped it around a sturdy fence post, securing the other end beneath the calf's torso as Marcus guided it. Together, straining against slick mud and panicked movement, they managed to pull the animal free. Both collapsed onto the grass afterward, breathless and coated in filth. The calf stumbled away shakily but alive. Marcus rolled onto his back, staring at the gray sky. "You didn't have to jump in," he said. Leela shrugged, wiping mud from her cheek. "You didn't either." He turned his head to look at her. There was no fear in her expression now, only determination. In that moment, something shifted irrevocably. She wasn't just a mouth to feed or a temporary worker. She had chosen to stand beside him in the mess, not behind him. And Marcus realized fear had never truly defined strength. Loyalty did. The valley's whispers reached their peak the following Sunday, when Pastor Graham unexpectedly visited the ranch after service. Marcus rarely attended church anymore, preferring solitude over sermons about forgiveness he wasn't sure he believed in. When the pastor's truck rolled up the long gravel drive, Marcus stiffened. Leela noticed immediately. "Should I go inside?" she asked quietly. Marcus considered it, then shook his head. "You live here, you don't hide." Pastor Graham stepped out with a cautious smile, hat in hand. "Marcus," he greeted warmly.
Been a while. Marcus nodded.
"What brings you out?" The pastor glanced toward Leela but kept his tone neutral. "Heard you had company. Wanted to see if everything's all right." Leela stood straighter, meeting his gaze with surprising calm. Marcus folded his arms. "She works here, that's all." The pastor studied them both before nodding slowly. "Works honest." He agreed. "So is kindness." Marcus didn't respond. After a few minutes of polite conversation, the pastor left, seemingly satisfied. But the visit stirred something deeper. That night, as they ate dinner, Leela spoke hesitantly. "Why do people think you're scary?" Marcus paused mid-bite. "Because I don't tolerate nonsense. Or because you don't let anyone in?" The question landed softly but struck hard. He set his fork down. "Letting people in doesn't always end well." Leela held his gaze. "Sometimes it does." Silence wrapped around them, heavy but not hostile. After dinner, she returned to her book while Marcus stepped outside. The sky stretched clear and wide above the ranch, stars scattered like distant lanterns. He leaned against the fence, replaying the past weeks, the storm, the meal, the fence repairs, the calf rescue. For years he had guarded his solitude like armor. Yet armor also isolated. Inside the house, light glowed warmly through the windows. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, that light felt like it belonged to more than memory. When he returned inside, he found Leela asleep again on the couch, book resting open on her chest. He gently closed it and placed it on the table. Then, after a brief hesitation, he draped an extra blanket over her shoulders. She stirred slightly but didn't wake. Marcus stood there longer than necessary, studying the peaceful expression on her face. One meal had opened the door. Work had built trust. And now the feared rancher of Blackridge Valley faced a truth he could no longer outrun. The girl he had taken in wasn't just changing his routine. She was rebuilding something inside him he thought had been buried forever. Winter arrived early in Blackridge Valley, rolling across the plains with sharp winds that howled through fence lines and rattled barn doors through the night. Frost clung to every blade of grass, turning the ranch into a landscape of silver and glass each morning. Marcus had lived through countless winters, each one testing the ranch's survival and his endurance. But this winter carried something unfamiliar, responsibility that reached beyond cattle and land. Leela had grown stronger over the past months. The oversized gloves now fit snugly after Mrs. Klein quietly exchanged them for smaller ones. Her movements around the ranch became more confident, her steps steady even on frozen ground. She learned to measure feed, check water trough heaters, and calm restless livestock during snowstorms. Marcus never praised her directly, but he stopped double-checking her work, which to him was a sign of trust far greater than words. One particularly brutal morning, a blizzard struck before sunrise, coating the valley in blinding snow and cutting visibility to mere feet. Marcus prepared the truck, layering himself in heavy gear. As he stepped onto the porch, he found Leela already there, pulling on her jacket with determined urgency. "Inside," he ordered immediately. "It's too dangerous." She shook her head firmly. "You'll need help if something goes wrong." Marcus opened his mouth to argue but stopped. He recognized that stubborn expression, the same refusal to back down he had once carried as a young rancher trying to prove himself to his father. They drove slowly through deep snowdrifts toward the western barn, where several pregnant cows were due to give birth within days. The storm battered the truck, wind rocking it violently. When they reached the barn, they discovered part of the roof had collapsed under the weight of accumulating snow. Marcus's heart dropped. Inside, frightened cattle crowded together, their panicked movement threatening injury. Without hesitation, Marcus waded into the chaos, shouting commands to steady them while inspecting structural beams. Leela followed, using her small frame to squeeze between animals, gently guiding them towards safer corners. Hours passed in freezing conditions as they reinforced weak beams and cleared snow. At one point, a beam cracked loudly above Marcus's head. Before he could react, Leela grabbed his arm and pulled him backward just as a heavy section of wood crashed down where he had been standing seconds earlier. The impact shook the entire barn. They stood frozen for a moment, snow and dust filling the air. Marcus stared at the shattered beam, then at Leela, whose face was pale but steady. "You could have been crushed," he said quietly. She shrugged, though her hands trembled slightly. "So could you." The simplicity of her answer hit him harder than the falling beam. By nightfall, they had stabilized the barn enough to keep the animals safe. Exhausted and frozen, they returned to the house, shedding snow, covered layers by the door. Marcus lit the fireplace while Leela brewed tea, a routine she had quietly adopted during cold nights. As they sat across from the fire, silence wrapped around them, but it felt different now, full rather than empty. "Why'd you stay?" Marcus asked suddenly, staring into the flames. "You could have left any time. Found easier places than this ranch." Leela considered the question carefully. "Because this is the first place that didn't feel temporary," she said softly. Marcus nodded, absorbing her words like embers settling into ash. Outside, the storm continued raging, but inside the ranch house, something far stronger than wind or snow had taken root, a bond forged through survival trust and quiet understanding neither of them had expected to find. The storm passed after 3 relentless days, leaving behind a valley buried beneath thick snowdrifts and broken fence lines scattered across the ranch. Repairs became urgent. Marcus worked longer hours than ever, and Leela matched him step for step despite exhaustion pulling at her shoulders. Yet the calm following the storm carried a new tension neither of them anticipated. Late one afternoon, as Marcus sorted equipment in the barn, a dark sedan approached the ranch driveway. Unfamiliar, polished, and out of place against the rugged landscape. Leela noticed it first from the house window. Her entire body stiffened, breath catching in her throat. Marcus stepped outside as the car stopped near the porch. A sharply dressed woman exited, accompanied by a uniformed deputy. Marcus recognized the tone of the visit immediately: official, deliberate, unavoidable. "Marcus Hale?" the woman asked, her voice professional but cautious. He nodded. "Name's Claire Donovan, Child Protective Services." Leela appeared in the doorway behind him, fear washing across her face like a shadow. Claire continued gently. "We received reports about a minor living and working here. We need to verify her safety and living conditions." Marcus's jaw tightened. He had expected this possibility for weeks but hoped it would never come. He glanced back at Leela, who stood frozen, clutching the doorframe as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. "She's safe," Marcus said firmly. "She's fed, housed, and treated with respect." Claire nodded calmly. "I'm sure you believe that, but we're required to evaluate the situation." "Leela, is it? Could you step outside and talk with us?" Leela hesitated, eyes darting toward Marcus. He gave a small nod, permission, reassurance, though his chest felt like it was being pulled apart. She stepped forward slowly. Claire spoke kindly but directly, asking about her past, her family, her time on the ranch. Leela answered honestly, her voice shaking only once when she described sleeping beneath bridges and being turned away from shelters. Claire listened carefully, occasionally jotting notes. Finally, she asked the question Marcus feared most. "Would you be willing to enter a licensed foster placement? It would ensure your legal protection and access to schooling." Leela's eyes filled with tears she tried desperately to hide. She looked at Marcus again, silently asking a question she didn't know how to speak aloud. Marcus stared at the ground, fists clenched at his sides. He knew the law. He knew he had no legal claim to keep her there, but he also knew sending her away would break something fragile they had both spent months rebuilding. Leela took a shaky breath. "Can I stay here?" she asked quietly. Claire's expression softened but remained professional. "That depends on whether Mr. Hale is willing to pursue legal guardianship or foster certification." Marcus looked up sharply. "That's possible." Claire nodded. "It's a long process. Home inspections, background checks, financial reviews, emotional evaluations. It won't be easy." Marcus glanced toward the ranch stretching endlessly behind him, the land that had defined his entire life. Then he looked at Leela, standing alone against the winter wind, terrified of losing the only place she had ever called safe. The decision formed before he could second-guess it. "Start the paperwork," he said quietly. Claire blinked in surprise. "Are you certain?" Marcus nodded once, his voice steady with a strength he hadn't felt in years. "I'm not letting her go back to surviving alone." Leela covered her mouth, tears finally spilling over as relief crashed through her like sunlight breaking storm clouds. The following months tested Marcus in ways ranch work never could. Inspections filled his schedule alongside livestock duties. Social workers visited regularly, examining everything from living arrangements to emotional stability. Marcus answered every question honestly, though speaking about his past forced him to confront grief he had buried for nearly 2 decades. He spoke of his wife and son, the car accident that stole them both during a winter storm much like the one that had brought Lila into his life. Each retelling felt like reopening an old wound, yet Leela sat quietly beside him during interviews, offering silent strength simply through her presence. Meanwhile, Leela enrolled in the small valley school. The transition frightened her more than blizzards or ranch work ever had. She struggled with classroom routines, social rules, and subjects she had missed during years of drifting. But she attacked learning the same way she attacked fence repairs, stubbornly and without complaint. Every afternoon, she returned home and completed assignments at the kitchen table, while Marcus pretended not to watch her progress with quiet pride. Spring eventually returned to Black Ridge Valley, melting snow into flowing streams that cut through green pastures. New calves stumbled across fresh grass, and wildflowers dotted the hills like bursts of color after months of white silence. On a warm April morning, Claire Donovan returned to the ranch carrying a folder thicker than any she had brought before. Marcus stood beside Lila on the porch as she approached. The wind moved gently through the fields, carrying the scent of thawing earth. Claire smiled, genuinely this time. "Congratulations," she said, handing Marcus the folder. "Guardianship approved." The words hung in the air like a sunrise neither of them expected to see. Leela stared at Marcus, disbelief flooding her expression. Marcus opened the folder slowly, scanning official documents stamped with state seals. His hands, usually steady even during cattle stampedes, trembled slightly. Leela suddenly threw her arms around him without hesitation. The gesture caught him off guard. He froze for a split second before carefully returning the embrace, resting a rough hand on her shoulder. It was the first time either of them openly acknowledged what they had become to each other. That evening, Marcus prepared stew again, the same meal he had served the night she first arrived. The kitchen smelled rich and familiar, memories blending with the present in a way that felt healing rather than painful. They sat across from each other at the table, sunlight pouring through open windows. "You know," Leela said softly, stirring her bowl, "that first meal saved my life." Marcus shook his head slightly. "You saved your own life. You just needed somewhere to rest." She smiled, not fragile like before, but strong, certain. Outside, cattle moved peacefully across endless fields, and the ranch stood quieter than it had in years, yet fuller than ever. Marcus stepped onto the porch later that night, watching the sunset paint the valley in gold and amber. Leela joined him, leaning against the railing. "What happens now?" she asked. Marcus looked across the land that had once been his entire world. Now it felt like something shared rather than carried alone. "Now," he said thoughtfully, "we keep going. Together." The valley would always remember Marcus Hale as the most feared rancher it had ever known. But over time, whispers changed. People began speaking of the man who rebuilt broken fences while teaching a lost girl how to find a home. And it all began the night he offered one simple meal. A meal that didn't just fill an empty stomach, but quietly changed 2 broken lives forever.